Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. What does a real man look like? What are the attributes of manliness? Every generation has had its own list, but for the most part, those lists almost always include a rugged independence, the search for power, a need for control, bravery in the face of danger, and a pull-yourself-up-by-your-own-bootstraps mentality. But when David prepared to hand over his kingdom to his son Solomon, he shared some dramatically different concepts about manliness and manhood. In David's mind, a real man was a godly man. He had a heart for God and a willingness to submit to the will of God, no matter what. Rather than pridefully independent, he would be humbly dependent upon God. He would recognize that his strength came from God, and his life was to bring glory and honor to God. Like any father, David wanted to see his son succeed in life. But he knew that the key to that happening was directly tied to Solomon's reliance upon God. Solomon is the newly appointed king of Israel, but David is still alive and will serve as the acting king until his death. Solomon will serve as his co-regent, and because of David's ill health and Solomon's youth, he will serve as the face of the crown, representing David in any public events. But in the meantime, David has a chance to pass on words of wisdom to his son while he's still living. David will give Solomon two sets of instructions. One will be spiritual in nature, the other personal. The first thing David does is pass on to his son what God had told him. Back when David had come up with the idea to build a house for the Lord, God had denied him that privilege. But God had also made a promise to David. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 through 16. David knew that the key to any success he had experienced as a king had been due to God, and he knew that the success of Solomon's reign was going to be dependent upon the Lord as well. So he passed along what God had told him, and he added a few vital words of encouragement and warning. Be strong, and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. 1 Kings 2, verses 2 through 3. Where had David gotten this bit of information? How could he be so sure that God would prosper Solomon if he would be obedient? All the way back in the book of Deuteronomy, long before there was a king in Israel, God had given the people of Israel a series of commands concerning the day when they would demand to have a king like all the other nations. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. Deuteronomy 17, verses 18 through 20. God had instructed that each and every king of Israel was to live by his law. The king was to keep a copy of the law on hand and have it read to him every day of his life. But it wasn't enough to be familiar with the content of the law. The king was to keep it, every word, statute, and commandment. There was to be no veering to the left or right, no cherry-picking or selective obedience. The health and longevity of the king's reign were going to be directly tied to his obedience to the law. So David makes sure Solomon is well aware of God's expectations. In fact, David ties Solomon's manhood to his ability to keep God's law. He tells him to act like a man and be strong, and he makes it clear that the proof of Solomon's manhood would be found in his obedience to God. But David knew what God knew. Solomon would sin. He would have times of disobedience just like David had. But God had promised to deal with Solomon in a loving manner, like a father to his son. If he sins, I will correct and discipline him with the rod, like any father would do. But my favor will not be taken from him, as I took it from Saul. 2 Samuel 7, verses 14 through 15. Yet David knew that obedience was preferable to discipline. It is far better to obey than to learn the difficult lessons that come as a result of God's loving hand of discipline. David had lost 3 sons due to his own sins. He had watched as 2 of his sons attempted to take his kingdom from him. He had seen innocent people die because of his disobedience, and he knew that living in submission and obedience to the will of God was far better in the long run and the true mark of a godly man. He also knew that obeying the Lord was going to take real strength. For Solomon to do what God commanded was going to take faith, trust, and a willingness to die to his own self-centered desires and wishes. Disobedience is the way of cowards. The words that David speaks to Solomon are very similar to those Joshua spoke to the people of Israel as he prepared for his own death. Therefore be very strong to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right hand or to the left, that you may not mix with these nations remaining among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day. Joshua 23, verses 7 through 8. Be strong, obey, don't veer to the right or left. Stay the course, cling to the Lord your God. Joshua knew what the people were going to have to do if they were to be successful in their attempt to possess the land. And David knew what Solomon was going to need to do if he was going to be successful in leading the people of Israel. His success would not be tied to his own leadership skills, the strength of his military, the combined intelligence of his cabinet, or the size of his kingdom. It would be directly tied to his willingness to obey God. Nothing more, nothing less. In his letter to the believers in Corinth, Paul gave a similar charge. He encouraged them to be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. 1 Corinthians 16, verses 13 through 14. Living the Christian life is anything but easy. Following the will of God is far more difficult than giving in to your own will. It isn't easy to stand firm in the faith you have in the gospel of Jesus Christ when everything around you seems to be caving in and waves of doubts confront you. Solomon was going to have days of doubt. He was going to have moments of despair. He would end up turning to all kinds of things like money, materialism, human wisdom, sexual pleasure, food, and even science in an attempt to seek meaning in life. In fact, he would chronicle his thoughts in the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon would end up surrounding himself with hundreds of wives and concubines, whose false gods would lead him astray. Solomon would start out strong, heeding his father's advice and obeying the Lord's commands, but his reign would end poorly. He would begin as a godly man, but not end that way. And the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and I will give it to your servant." 1 Kings 11, verses 9 through 11. Hundreds of wives and concubines did not make Solomon a man. A mighty kingdom and a massive army didn't make Solomon a man. A reputation for wisdom and wealth didn't make Solomon a man. A true man is a godly man, a man who loves, fears, and obeys his God. A godly man is a man who knows his help is from the Lord, who realizes that he is nothing apart from the presence and power of God in his life. Faith in God requires real strength. Disobedience is easy, which is why Paul calls us to be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong.